Woohoo! Okay, last one. Where were we before? We were saying that science suggests that the ideal doesn't really exist, right? There's only one form of truth in this Platonic sense, but that form of truth is the physical world. And this is a book that supports that. And it starts off that if you believe in this kind of ideal, then you're probably just crazy, because that's what happened to Don Quixote, the character. But here's the cool thing, because now Cervantes is going to take this more postmodern way of looking at the truth, in which there are multiple perspectives on what the truth is. And that's just awesome, because he's going to take this perspective that there is one truth, that science is correct, but then he's also going to leap ahead about 400 years philosophically and suggest that actually that perspective, that science gives you all the truth there is itself faulty. Oh, it's so freaking awesome. All right, so imagine a world in which we didn't believe in the ideal. On the test, one of the very last test questions sort of asks you to actually kind of imagine that. All right, so science says the ideal doesn't really exist. There's only this physical world. I guess I pretty much buy into that. But imagine that if you didn't believe in the ideal. Imagine a world without beliefs in something more, something eternally good, something true and beautiful. Imagine a world without stories. And so that's the second part of what this book is about. Don Quixote may be crazy, but imagine a world without crazy. So the first part, this is a two-part lecture. First part we actually got to talk about some math, which is, I'm going to try and boil this down. You can try and make sense of the notes of this online if you possibly can. This is a lecture I stole from a math teacher here on campus. All right. So we're going to use this term useful fictions as a way to think about, well, we'll get to it. All right. So let's talk about the history of math super duper briefly from a guy who basically flunked out of math in high school in his sophomore year. The old way of thinking about math, the way that the Greeks thought about math, didn't use concepts like the zero. And they didn't use concepts like negative numbers. And they refused to use concepts like infinity. They knew about these concepts, but they specifically wrote about how you could not use them. So the idea is, if you think about it, that math had to refer back to something that you could feel or touch, which for me is really strangely philosophically ironic, because math is supposed to take you to the ideal, but the Greeks wanted to root their math in the physical world. I don't know enough about the philosophy of math to know why, but I know that that's true. So they thought that you couldn't have zero. You can't have zero of something. You can not have something, but you can't have zero, right? Let's say you don't have a cow, okay? That's not having a cow. That's not having zero cows. You can't have -1 cows. You can't have -5 cows. I'm walking out to the barn. What you gonna do? I want to milk my -1 cow. No, it's just absurd. Now, there's a huge thing about how there couldn't have infinitesimals. You couldn't have infinity. And here's why you can't have infinity. Imagine infinity. Okay, you got it? Imagine the most there is of anything, the biggest of whatever it is. Now add 1. Now you have infinity again. Add 1 again. So the Greeks thought these ideas were absurd, so we're going to just stay away from them. Don't touch these things that can't exist in the real world. But over time, modern math starts to incorporate these more and more. And this is the part where I spend like half an hour in class talking about the nature of calculus. I'm not going to try and do this online. It's pretty fun, especially for somebody like me who's never taken calculus to try and explain it. But these guys slowly over time, and if you look at the dates around the 1500s, these mathematicians are starting to say, well, we can use these things like zero, which, by the way, is a concept that was introduced. If you watched the video on Muslims, how they basically invented the Renaissance, the idea of a cipher, that is obviously an Arab word. Okay, so some of these concepts started getting into math through the Muslim world, who basically keeps working on math when the rest of Europe is in the Dark Ages. And these guys, around the 1500s, as they start sort of getting back during the Renaissance and scientific revolution, they start using more and more complicated mathematical ideas like zero, negative, infinity. And Bombelli calls these imaginary solutions. Leibniz, who is the father of modern calculus, Two people invented calculus, by the way. One was Newton, and this is relevant. Newton, during the plague in London, he goes back to live with his mother out in the countryside, because the way that you got away from the plague in London in the 1600s was you socially distance. So he goes back home and he's got free time on his hands, and what he decides to do is he decides to invent calculus. But because he's on the spectrum, people believe he's autistic, he never tells anybody about it. And then this guy Leibniz, who is a big philosopher, who, if you ever take English 258, we'll talk about a whole bunch. He invents, in Germany, he ends up inventing calculus too, as well. And then there's a big argument about who did it first. Newton did it first, but the one that you use, the form that you use, is actually done by Leibniz. He calls all of these things like negative numbers, like imaginary numbers, and like zero, he calls these useful fictions. And what he ends up proving, what all these mathematicians at this time end up proving, is that things like calculus use formulas based on imaginary solutions and useful fictions to accurately describe very real things about the physical world. In other words, get this in the test, you can use fiction to describe the real world. So let's say there's a real thing, like the planets are going around the sun, or the thing that they really wanted to figure out with calculus was acceleration, right? You can say lots of things about something that's standing still, and I can say things using physics about something that is going 50 miles an hour, but how do I measure the moments that it is going from 0 to 50? Because I can break these down into infinitely small pieces, infinitely small units. And the only way that we can do this is we need to use these fictional types of numbers in order to describe this real action. The orbiting of something, threw Galileo off and Kepler and these guys, is they thought that the planets must go around the sun in a perfect circle, but of course they don't. They go around it in an ellipse, right? And they couldn't figure this out. And so the only way to figure out these kind of complex motions, these complex actions of mass and energy, is to use these weird fictional concepts. We can use fictional concepts in physics and math to describe things that are real. All right. So that changes everything. Because we kind of went from all there is physics, all there is math and energy, and that's all that science is. But the deeper we get into the scientific revolution, we realize that we can talk about these complex real things by using things that don't exist. We can use the ideal to describe the real physical world. And those concepts are starting to come online right about the time that Don Quixote is coming online. Okay, so Don Quixote is a story at first that is saying that if you believe in the ideal, you must be crazy. But then math and science don't actually explain the human condition. They don't really explain our emotional condition. Yeah, now you can use, hormones and figure out what's going on within the synapses of your mind, but none of that really helps you understand what it means to be a human being. We can use science probably to whip the ass of this COVID thing, but we need stories in order to understand our experiences. All right. So after bashing the ideal, Cervantes wants to explore why it's necessary. It's something that we need. So let's go back to Grisostomo. In the last lecture, we said that like Don Quixote, Grisostomo's the guy who's a student. He dresses up like a shepherd because he wants to chase after the pure ideal, which is Marcella. And what happens? It kills him. All right? You dumbass. You chase the ideal, you're just going to end up dying. You're going to get beaten up. You're going to get beaten up the way that Don Quixote gets beaten up. Okay? Because he can't reconcile his idealized love with reality. But that's not all that happens within that story. Because his suffering produces all kinds of beauty. He writes this poem that nobody on the planet has actually read all of, all right? But his funeral itself becomes this festival. His funeral, the celebration of his tragedy, right? Remember that tragedy was celebrated through these Dionysian parties by the Greeks. That can create something that's beautiful. And all of the shepherds who are weeping over him, they also think that his life is beautiful. And so that the scene actually opens up, right? When Don Quixote and Sancho come upon these shepherds in the first place, that night the shepherds sing songs. They've wrote poems about this poet, right? So without these stories of these people living these tragic lives, then our lives are incredibly boring. We're back to Achilles. Achilles has this choice about whether he can go home and live a ripe old age, which will be boring as shit, or he can die young as a part of the ideal. He will lose his physical life, but that he will become a part of the ideal. And he does. Achilles, literally, there was a human being named Achilles, and he dies young in war, and we're talking about him today, and his experience helps us understand our experience. The purpose of stories about heroes is to explain our lives to us in ways that only poetry can, that only songs can, that only art can, because science can't do that. Marcella. We got to talk about Marcella, okay? Backstory, remember that she has a beautiful mother, so she has inherited beauty. She has a rich father, but her mother dies young, and her father dies of grief, which is itself very romantic. So she's raised by her uncle, who's a priest, and she's raised to be incredibly intelligent, and she's raised to be independent. All the boys start chasing after her because she's the most beautiful woman ever that they've seen. And the uncle, priest, kind of interestingly, strangely, of all the people to tell her this, says, hey, go off and do your own thing, right? So she's relentlessly pursued for her beauty. Note how the town just only sees her physicality, right? She's stuck living with her mass, right? They're not interested in her intelligence. They only see the ideal of her physicality. And what's kind of interesting is that being the ideal traps her, which is kind of an interesting concept. This is a little weird, but I have on occasion, every few years, had women in my classrooms who are just stunningly beautiful, like model beautiful. And it's really wild to see them sort of struggle with this. Some of you are going, I wonder if he's talking about me. No, sorry, sunshine. I'm not talking about you. All right. Because all the guys are weird with these women. Like just randomly watching dudes hit on these women in class all the time. And you realize these women have to walk down the street and have to deal with that. So, on the other hand, it's probably awesome to be really beautiful. I wouldn't know. But on the other hand, Cervantes is sort of saying, yeah, what's it like to be that woman? To be alive in 1600 and be beautiful is to be trapped by your physicality. So she escapes, like Don Quixote escapes, and she employs a useful fiction. She cross-dresses, and very much for a woman to dress as a man at this time would have been seen, in 1600, a woman dressing as a man would have been seen the same way we see a man dressing as a woman. Today, we're all super familiar or just kind of comfortable with women dressing as men. Like any of you women right now that are wearing shorts right now, or you're wearing long pants, even when my mother was young, that was considered cross-dressing, all right? In the 50s, that was cross-dressing. So this is kind of cool, is this whole idea that as a woman, she doesn't need to be tied to her physicality. She can employ a useful fiction to improve her own life. So her profoundly sexist culture blames her for Chrysostomo's death. Like literally it's victim blaming, right? There's basically, and this would have been real, if a woman is raped at this period of time, then she's going to be blamed for it. And sort of as a side note, in this 800-page book, over and over and over again, the stories are retold of these women being raped. Now, Marcella's not raped, but over and over again. And the way that these women are raped is, at this time, there wasn't formal marriage. And so the men would say that they had married this woman and they would have sex with them. And then in the story over and over again, I think it's told like 5 or 6 different times to different women. Then the men turn out to have said the same thing to another woman. And so the woman is pregnant, but they're not actually married. So the abuse of these beautiful women is something that Cervantes writes about over and over again. And what's really wild about this is in 1600, this dude, this Spanish dude, a culture that's known for its whole machismo, this Spanish dude gives her probably one of the most intelligent arguments in the entire book. And so she intelligently, with her mind, not her body, she says, She doesn't need to fall in love with Grisostomo even though he's beautiful. She can respect the fact that he was beautiful, but not all in beauty inspires love. All right? She's going to be very Socratic about this. She's going to go about this in a very logical way. A woman need never surrender her own will simply because another loves her. Right? That's a pretty wild argument to make in 1600, because of course you had to marry whoever you were told to. And she says, why should she have to? True love must be voluntary and not forced. And she says, I didn't choose this body. I don't deserve to be punished for it. It's not her fault she's beautiful, so why is she being held responsible for it? Right? I was born free, and in order to remain free, I choose the solitude of the fields. And then this really cool image in which I'm that distant fire, that sharp-edged sword that does not burn or cut, right? So she has this idea of this, like if there's a fire out there, if like you're standing on one side of your yard and there's a fire and you walk up and you stick your hand in the fire and it burns you, are you going to blame the fire? It's like, no, dumbass, you touched the fire. So the fact that Grisostomo has fallen in love with her is his responsibility for her. The main thing I want you to see here is two things. One is that Cervantes has given us a woman as one of the most important characters and most intelligent characters in this book about who is sane and who has the freedom to do whatever they want to. And you're definitely going to want to think about that in terms of The Wife of Bath's Tale. Nope, sorry. Well, actually you would, but we hadn't read that. The Miller's Tale and The 1001 Nights. Yeah, we said that. Okay. Sancho. Got to talk a little bit about Sancho. Sancho suffers physically over and over again, and he just gets the shit beat out of him. But throughout this 800-page book, they keep going back home every now and then, and he has this choice about whether or not he wants to go stay at home or whether he wants to go out and get the shit kicked out of him again. And he keeps choosing to get the shit kicked out of him again, right? Because, what would you rather do? Would you rather go out with a crazy man and have adventures, or would you just rather stay and plow your field? Right? So, Sancho's wife's response is that, next time you come back, bring me back some money. And every time he comes home, she's like, bring me back some physical, something tangible about you having these adventures. And he says, you know what? I have something better than money. I have stories of doing this thing. You think about why you go hunting if you go deer hunting. You're probably a bunch of city slickers. But, it's not because you're bringing back meat. You can go get meat at the supermarket. You're going because you're going to get stories. Or if you go rock climbing. Or if you go mountain biking. You just go to the gym. But why do you go out and have adventures? So that you can have adventures. So Sancho is this completely, utterly physical character. He's at the bottom of this Platonic thing. His body is completely stuck. Think about the tower. Or the ladder of Eros. Sancho is at the very bottom of the ladder. He's purely physical. He has to eat and drink, and that's all he cares about. But slowly over time, he starts being lured further and further into the idea that that's not enough. You also have to feed the ideal. And so he loves the stories. He's told that he will someday become a governor of an island. And there's this awesome section in book 2, incredibly postmodern thing, which we're going to get into in a few minutes here. This postmodern part where Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are wandering around and they meet people in the second book who have read the first book. They keep meeting people who've read the first book. And they meet this rich king and queen, and they're like, oh yeah, we read a story about you guys. And it goes on for about 100 pages how this rich king and queen, they set up this massive game where they're going to play along and sort of everyone's going to dress up in the characters from the first book. And they're just going to play along. And they have this basically fantasy world. And in that fantasy world, they take Sancho and they give him a village to become the governor of. And so he gets to become like the mayor of this village. So he actually kind of realizes his dream. And of course, it's not really an island. And of course, all the people are playing along with him. But that's kind of the point, is that you can buy into the game and your life will be improved. Fantasy, the ideal, doesn't have to be real to be worth investing in. Briefly, in the first part that we read, the very first section, when they go to the inn, Don Quixote meets all these prostitutes, and he insists on calling the prostitutes Doña, which is this title of respect. It would be a word that you would use for only for rich women. And so he basically takes everybody that he meets and treats them in this bizarre, crazy fantasy way, but pretty much his fantasy lifts people up. It takes people up the ladder, and it takes a prostitute and turns her into a ma'am, essentially. All right, second book. Don't worry, this part's not too long. Okay, we're going to get into how the second book, or no, we're not even the second book. We got to get into this idea of postmodernism. Okay, so we start with modernism, which is this idea of science, and that the basic way of thinking about how you would represent scientific thinking about what reality is you would come up with a novel. And what is a novel? A novel is a work of realism, right? So we have this character who has read too many fantasies, and fantasies are not reality. So a novel is a book about how he confronts reality and how the ideal and the reality can't be reconciled. That's what that first lecture was all about. Now, had Cervantes only done that, then he would have done something really freaking awesome. He would have invented the novel, and he would have invented realism. But now he's going to critique realism in the same way that we just critiqued science. So, if you think about it, The Office, which is pure realism, there are no dragons, there's no magic in The Office. And the Game of Thrones, which is pure fantasy, it's pure romance, there are dragons and there are magic, they're both fiction. Realism only appears real, but it's just as fictional. That is, The Office, or this novel, Don Quixote, is just a shadow puppet the same way that a Game of Thrones or The Hobbit is a shadow puppet. Realism appears to be real because it looks real, but it's not. It's just completely bullshit, all right? When Pam and Jim were falling in love, man, I got so wrapped up in that, but they were just actors. They weren't really falling in love. And The Office is every bit as contrived. It's just shot on a studio with cameras, with actors, the same way that Game of Thrones is shot in a studio with cameras and actors. And Don Quixote is about that. All right, so let's go all the way back to the very, very beginning, the prologue of the first book. There's a quiz question about this, I think. He's talking about, the narrator is saying, hey, I wrote this book, and now I got to do is I got to crank out a prologue, and apparently in Spanish prologues you had to have quotes by famous people, and I'm stuck, I can't write this thing. And so in the prologue, the narrator said, well, a friend of mine came in, and he said, well, just make that shit up, all right? Make up quotes. And so at the very beginning, as he's producing this first work of realism, he's reminding us that everything is made up. It's freaking genius. You come up with your first work of reality, and then you just make fun of writing works of reality. And the very best part of this, probably the most important part of this story as far as what I'm interested in, is these chapters 8 and 9. So, right in chapter 8, he goes and Don Quixote goes and he fights against the windmills. Okay, everyone knows that image. And so then they're all busted up. And then the next thing is he sees the stagecoach, and there are these two priests, these monks, and there are a couple of Biscayans, which are Basques, right? And he thinks that it's this guy from a story, blah, blah, blah. So he attacks them. He's totally fucking losing his shit, right? He's just totally crazy. And there's an awesome, crazy scene where he's fighting against one of the squires, and they're pillow fighting. They have their swords, but they're holding up pillow fights. And it's a moment of absolute pure realism, right? It's a satire of a romance, because it's just the whole thing is about how crazy it is to think that there are actual knights in armor, or that you're actually a knight in armor. No, you're just a crazy dude and you're attacking people with pillows. So there it is, the height of realism and the height of making fun of fantasy. And right at that very moment, at the height of the realistic action, the narrator says that he lost the book, that there's no more pages. So he reminds us that it's just a work of fiction. It's just freaking brilliant, right? Realism wasn't a real book. Cervantes is just pretending that he's reading a real book. It's an author pretending that he's telling you a story that he read and that he can't find the rest of it. And he's just breaking down that fourth wall and reminding us that it's all made up. So then he says, I was really into this story. So I was wandering around a couple years later, and I was in a market, and I found this thing that I thought sure looked a lot like Don Quixote, but it was written in Arabic. And he says the author was an Arab. That nation is known for its lying propensity, right? So it's just freaking brilliant. I found a story that I'm pretending is true, but it's written by a culture that tells lies. I'm reminding you that this story, no matter how true it looks like, is just a lie. So then he actually says, I can't read Arabic. So I went off. I can't read a story in Arabic written by a liar. So I went and I found a different Moor, a Muslim Arab. I found another one of these guys to read it and translate it for me. And it's just awesome, right? So here I'm trying to tell you that the story's real, but it was written by a liar. And then I found some random dude to translate it. So whatever story you're getting is not true. Oh, it's just so unbelievably fun. And it's so profoundly postmodern, right? He's basically aware. We'll get into that. I'm getting ahead of the game. Okay. So book 2, we're going to come back to some of this stuff. So in book 2, the sequel, at the very beginning, you read in the book 2 that the narrator says, hey, I had to read a sequel because some other guy had written a sequel. And this is true. So Cervantes writes this book. He's done with the book. He sells it. He's just, I'm done with that story. It's so popular that a guy writes fan fiction. This Avellenda guy writes fan fiction and it starts selling. And so Cervantes realized, oh shit, man, somebody's making money off my book. So he writes this other book. But then it creates this really fun thing because then he can have Don Quixote and Sancho wander around meeting people who have read the first book written by Cervantes, but also Avellaneda, whatever. All right. So, and then they get to argue about which book is real. So now we get into this awesome postmodern kind of stuff. You have Don Quixote and you have Sancho Carrasco Sanson Carrasco and Sancho. They're discussing the first book. And Don Quixote basically says that a book must be a work of absolute truth. And Sancho says a book must be the work of absolute truth. And they disagree about the nature of the truth, right? Because Don Quixote says the truth is the ideal. And the problem with the first book is that it tore down the ideal. And then Sancho says the great thing about the first book is that it was realistic, right? It's based in the physical world. So you have these characters in the book discussing this whole thing that the book is talking about, which is what is the nature of reality. So you have this one thing, that's cool, but it's also this metatextual thing in which the characters are talking about themselves as if they were real and the characters in the book are fake. Ah, so great. Don Quixote again reminds us that the book was written by a Moor, and from the Moors you never could hope for a word of truth, seeing that they are all of them cheats, forgers, and schemers. So you have this fictional character talking about a book about himself and then talking about how realistic it is. But obviously the guy that's doing the talking also doesn't exist. Okay. So actually here we'll jump. So this is what we're talking about. This is metatextualism. So you guys got to watch Archer, BoJack Horseman, and we're binging on Community lately, and it goes back into this stuff. And it's which the characters directly analyze their own genres, right? So Archer it's kind of a satire of spy thrillers, but they keep referring back to the fact that they are in these kind of spy thrillers. They know that they're in a TV show. BoJack Horseman, the exact same thing. BoJack keeps referring slyly to the fact that he is in a TV show about community shows. And Community is just, over and over again, it's doing this kind of references to other kinds of films. You can Google the 68 references to other films in Community if you want to find out more about this stuff. So you guys are just, your generation is just totally into this, where a new show is basically just doing a throwback to an old kind of show. And this is called pastiche. And it's kind of parody. It's kind of satire, right? So Don Quixote begins as like a satire romances. Archer is a satire of basically 007. But then in order to be a satire of something, you have to study it so deeply. It's clear that you really completely love these things, right? Community is basically making fun of all these different movies, But then over and over again, the end of Community is sort of reaffirms that these kind of stories were useful and that, here, let's get to the main point, Drake. The main point is the story Don Quixote starts off poking fun at romances, but the entire thing is a romance. It's as if Cervantes wants to just talk shit about romances, but it's clear, and he draws our attention to this, that he's read every single romance out there. And by the end of this, you realize that he has a lot of respect for Don Quixote. He's a clown, but he's a clown that we kind of respect. So all of this kind of stuff where the characters talk about themselves and refer back to the kind of genre that they're in, all this kind of stuff that your generation's totally into, this all starts with this novel, Don Quixote, which is pretty wild to have been the dude who invented that. Okay? Don Quixote and Sancho are arguing about what the truth is. We talked about this. Got to tell the bad parts. Don Quixote says the purpose of literature is to elevate ourselves towards the ideal. Okay? Don Quixote even says that the historians who don't write books about the truth, they should be burned, is so profoundly, profoundly ironic because he's not the truth. He doesn't exist. The person who says that books should be burned that aren't realistic doesn't actually exist. The layers of irony here are just so freaking awesome. All right. Now, finally, we get into this deeper level of Don Quixote's consciousness. And remember that this thing is written at the same time that Hamlet is written. Don Quixote says, "To say and write witty things is a mark of genius. The cleverest character in a comedy is the clown, since he who would make himself out to be a simpleton cannot be one." Elsewhere, we have the quote in the very beginning of this lecture in which Don Quixote says, "I know who I am, but I know who I could be if I choose." And you realize that he's not crazy. He's just decided that he's going to play at a fantasy because the ideal doesn't need to be real in order for it to be valuable. His life will be improved because he just doesn't want to be an old man dying of old age on a farm. He wants to be this character. That's what he wants his life to be about. And nobody, fuck you if you want to stop him, is basically what he's saying. The same way Marcella says, "I won't be tied to my physicality. I'll be whoever I want to." Okay? Hamlet, "I hereafter shall think it meet to put on an antic disposition on." He decides that he's going to play to be a crazy person. Now, the irony of both of these stories, and we don't have time to go into this, we talk about this if we get into Hamlet a lot, is like, what about a crazy person deciding he's going to pretend to be crazy? Might he still be crazy? And that's always an interesting question. All right, one more. The way that this story ends is that the Knight of the White Moon, which is actually their buddy, is Carrasco. All right. The Knight of the White Moon fights him, making this agreement that if I defeat you, right, his friend dresses up as a knight and says, if I defeat you, then you have to give up your fantasy for a year. So, right, note the irony here is I'm going to dress up and play into your fantasy in order to stop you from fantasizing. The only way I can defeat you is to play with you. And this happens over and over throughout this 800-page book. If I play along with you, things will go well. If I buy into the ideal, if I make a leap of faith, my life may actually be improved. Science may be real, but I might need some magic juju to get through the hard times. Okay? So anyway, Don Quixote gets beaten by the Knight of the White Moon. They take him home. On the way home, he sees these shepherds, and he's like, hey, maybe I'll pretend to be a shepherd. So it's kind of like he's holding out a little bit of hope that, if I can't partake in one fantasy, I'll just create another. But in the end, they've cured him. And by curing him, and he dies. Which kind of raises this question, and this is what the story is about, What happens when we let go of our ideal? What happens when we let go of our fantasy? But what's left of us? And, this guy just basically dies. So, we're in the year 1600. We started out this class in 2700 BC. Remember, it was Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh faces the death of his friend Enkidu. So he goes off to find the ideal, maybe he doesn't find it, right? He goes back and he realizes that the quest of looking for it is what will sustain him. Now he's ready to go back and live his life. Achilles wants to live the ideal. He wants to live forever like a god. And he realizes that he can't. that we can't, he's tied to his physicality. His physicality is that death's going to happen. But by partaking of that ideal, he can become the ideal. He won't live forever as a human being in his physical body, but his story will live forever. And Odysseus, the way that he's going to deal with his PTSD is through the telling of these stories. It's going to be the thing that actually cures him. And then we got into tragedies, and tragedies were these art form in which we will take the worst things that happen to us, say like people dying of viruses, saying of the semester being shut down. I realize those two may not be the same. And kind of going, what can we do with these horrible experiences? Well, we can tell stories about them, and we can elevate them and understand them in these non-scientific, irrational ways. That sometimes our lives will be irrational. Our lives were making sense. We're going to get degrees. We're going to get jobs. Our lives are going to be awesome. And then wham, comes along this weird, crazy, tragic thing and knocks us all askance. And we're like, well, that's just how life is. We can't always achieve the ideal, but somehow we can tell stories that will reshape these experiences into something that sustains us. In the tragedy of Agamemnon, right? We suffer and we learn that there's something that stories can do that can take our suffering and turn it into something where we actually learn. Okay. So what stories do, what a story like this does is it gives us inspiration. And the word inspiration means to inspire, means spirit. The word spirit, actually, the Greek word spirit means to breathe. To inspire is to breathe in. And the Greeks thought that it's through breathing in that you take in the spirit of everything. And then when you breathe out, you tell your story. And that's what this class has been about. The telling of the story. You breathe in the physical reality of oxygen, but you speak out words, and words can shape your experiences into stories. And through stories, our lives can be elevated towards the ideal, even if the ideal doesn't exist. Okay, now, the last two questions on the test have to do with a similar question. Don't just vomit back what I just said to you. Think about the questions themselves. And with that, other than taking the tests and grading the tests, we're done.